evening, and thank you for joining us. I'm Jennifer Lezak, Coordinator of Special Projects with the Adult Services Department, and on behalf of everyone at the Chicago Public Library, welcome. We're so happy to welcome a wonderful conversation with two Chicago authors, Miles Harvey and Emily Gray Tedrow, to the CPL virtual stage tonight for a conversation on their new books featuring stories of deception and intrigue. This event is co-sponsored by the Seminary Co-op, 5751 South Woodlawn Avenue. Books for this event can be purchased by going to the Seminary Co-op event website at semcoop.com. Our thanks to Seminary Co-op and all the folks over there for their support of tonight's event. During tonight's program, we encourage you to leave your questions in the chat, which we'll be monitoring and will ask the authors at the end of the program. Now, a little bit about our authors. Miles Harvey is the author of the international bestseller, The Island of Lost Maps, and the recipient of a Knight-Wallace Journalism Fellowship. His book, Painter in a Savage Land, was named a Chicago Tribune Best Book of the Year. He teaches at DePaul University. His new book, The King of Confidence, A Tale of Utopian Dreamers, Frontier Schemers, True Believers, False Prophets, and the Murder of an American Monarch, digs into the strange and largely unknown story of James Strang and the singular moment in the antebellum America that allowed him and the new breed of confidence men to thrive. Impeccably researched and compulsively readable, The King of Confidence not only illuminates one of the stranger chapters in our nation's past, but slyly holds a mirror up to its present. The confidence man emerged in full force from the antebellum United States, and in telling Strang's story, The King of Confidence elegantly suggests that this uniquely American archetype has not faded, but only persisted. Emily Gray Tedrow is the author of the novels Blue Stars and Commuters. She has received an Illinois Arts Council Award, as well as fellowships from the Ragdale Foundation, Virginia Center for the Creative Arts, and the Sewanee Writers Conference. A frequent book reviewer for USA Today, as well as other publications, Emily also writes essays, interviews, and short stories. Her new book, The Talented Miss Farwell, was inspired by the true story of the woman who pulled off the biggest municipal fraud in U.S. history, embezzling over $50 million in a period spanning more than 20 years. The Talented Miss Farwell explores greed and obsession, survival and self-invention, and the brilliant cunning of a female con. Now, it is my great pleasure to welcome Miles and Emily to the CPL stage. Welcome.
Thanks. Glad to be here.
Thank you. Thanks, Jennifer. Hey, Miles, how are you doing?
Emily, it's great to see you. I just finished this wonderful book today and urge everyone to go out and buy a copy, and I'm really anxious to talk to you about it.
Oh, I don't know. You're kind of making my day right here and right back at.
Yeah, this is fantastic. So why don't we get into it, Emily? I was wondering if you could just sort of describe your book to folks.
Yeah, absolutely. So The Talented Miss Farwell is a novel, and it explores the sort of story of one woman. Her name is Becky Farwell, and she starts as a young woman growing up in a very sort of poor rural area in Southwest Illinois. And she is orphaned rather early. Before that, she helps turn around her father's farming business. And she has these skills of, sort of prodigious math talents, economic talents, financial acumen, and a lot of ambition. But this is a time and a place where that's not really rewarded. So while she succeeds on one level, having a very successful career in the town government, something happens where she becomes incredibly obsessed with visual art, sort of like a lightning strike. She never expected it. She didn't grow up that way. She never had access to museums or the privilege to go view art in person. But when it happens once by accident, she becomes obsessed to the point where she is able to use her financial skills to skim money in order to fund art purchases. And this kicks off what will turn out to be kind of like an epic lifelong crime, sort of a mega crime, if you will. And so the novel really explores the kind of back and forth between her two double lives. And I had a blast writing it.
It's interesting, Becky, the protagonist of your book, or anti-hero of your book in a way, you used the word obsessed, and the guy I wrote about was obsessed too. from a very young age. So my book's nonfiction, right? So I'm dealing with real life, but no less kind of strange story. The guy I wrote about grew up in the antebellum period, which are those decades leading up to the Civil War. And his name was James Strang. And one of the cool things is we have his diaries from the time he was a young man, you know, from maybe 17, 18 to maybe 20, 21, 22, 23. And
Amazing.
He writes a lot about in code, he writes these secret obsessions. And he says, I've always had dreams of royalty and power. And one of the things he talks about is like, oh, you know, if I could just get the chance, I would marry Princess Victoria, later to be Queen Victoria, and be King of England. And he's kind of serious. But this is the amazing thing about him. And I think it's sort of interesting about our two books is that both of these people are just amazing self-realizers. And so Strang actually went off and later he remade himself, reinvented himself on the Western frontier and became a prophet of God, and eventually moved to Beaver Island in northernmost Lake Michigan and declared himself king of earth and heaven. And the story kind of goes from there. I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. But when I was reading your book and when you were talking about Becky's obsessive qualities, I thought, you know, that there's something about these people that it drives them, these two con artists we write about. You know, I was wondering how you got into this story at the center of the talented Miss Farwell.
Yeah, you know, it's so I know Jennifer mentioned that it is loosely based on a true story. And I know, you know, and those of our audience members here who recognize it and certainly are from the Chicago region, recognize the fact that there was a woman in a small Illinois town in the mid 2010s who was arrested and indicted for embezzling $50 million from her tiny town over the course of 20 years. So I happened to be driving one day and, you know, maybe like carpooling my kids. I heard NPR breaking this story. And of course I was interested. I mean, we were all fascinated when this news broke. But the thing that kind of captivated me as a writer, as a novelist, I should say, is when the news reporter went on to say that although the FBI had evidence that she had committed this crime, they held off on arresting her for about 6 weeks, 8 weeks, because, as they put it, they didn't believe that a woman alone could pull off that kind of complex crime. I mean, it would turn out to be the greatest municipal fraud in US history. So essentially, the investigators were looking for her male boss or co-conspirator. And that's the part that grabbed me as a writer. I just thought, wow, I have got to think and imagine what it would be like to pull off that kind of double life and stay in the place where you were born and raised, a tiny town, and continue to live there, continue to know your neighbors, chat with them, go to church, go to the school functions, etc., while still, you know, bleeding this town dry. So what I did was, and I know I'm curious, I mean, you with the facts and me with the fiction, I'm curious how it works for you, but what I did was I instantly stopped reading anything about the actual events, the true story. I stopped following the news. I turned it off anytime it came on because I really wanted to kind of preserve this imaginative space for me to create my own character and whom I would take into the art world and sort of create that as her kind of journey. And so it is loosely inspired, and I kept the numbers the same, right? There is this actual crime occurred over the course of 20 years with $50 million. So I kept the numbers the same and the area the same, but I kind of made up everything else, which I know is pretty different from what you do as a fact-based writer. And how did you stumble on Strang, and how is that all true? Like when you describe it, I'm like, oh, that's the craziest novel. I can't, but it's not a novel. This really happened. This man proclaimed himself, you know, king of, what did you say?
Earth and heaven, man. He did not take like, it wasn't like,
no.
you know, king of a little town somewhere.
No, he's not a drinking violet, this Strang. How did you come to him?
Well, you know, I came to him slowly and then all of a sudden. So maybe 20, maybe 15 years ago, there's a little town called Burlington, Wisconsin, which I'm sure some of our viewers know. It's about 2 hours northwest of Chicago. And my brother-in-law, a guy named Chris Carr, who's I consider a good friend, grew up there, and we were up visiting Chris's parents many years ago, and I was driving around town with him, and he started showing me these old houses and saying, "Oh, look, there was this Mormon colony here, for this kind of spin-off Mormon colony, and they were led by this charismatic leader, and kind of a strange character, and then he went off and got himself killed, and then I grew up with the remnants of this Strangite sect of the Mormon Church." And so I was fascinated by that, but I didn't think much of it. And then, I don't know, 5 years ago, I got a call or an email from my agent who said there's an editor at Little Brown, a big New York publishing house, who wants to talk to you about possibly doing a book. And I'll talk about why I decided to do the book, but I was just so grateful for that opportunity. It turned out this was just a perfect thing for me to write about. And I'll get into that later. But Emily, I was wondering if you would mind just reading a little bit of the novel to us. I'd really love to give readers a taste for Becky.
Sure, I'd love to. I thought, and I'm so interested in all of these kind of corollaries between these two characters that we have. I mean, starting with the fact that they're within our driving range here to see them here in the Midwest, or what used to be the West, I guess, when Strang was around. But yeah, I'd love for you guys to meet Becky. Maybe I'm just going to read the first page or so of the novel so you can see where she comes from, and the fact that she starts from pretty humble beginnings. So this is the beginning of the book, Chapter 1, Pearson, Illinois, 1979. 14-year-old Becky Farwell lay on the truck horn with her forearm. "Daddy, let's go." Engine running, she tilted the rear view to study her eye makeup, a wash of greens running dark to light from her eyelashes to eyebrows. Greens, of course, because the magazine said all redheads had to, even indistinct blonde red mixes like her own. What she really wanted was the set that gave you 3 kinds of purple: pale violet, dusky eggplant. Becky ran a quick calculation on how much she was owed by the 4 girls she did homework for: geometry and algebra, although she could stretch up to pre-calc too, even as a 9th grader. Though for pre-calc, all she could guarantee was a B, not that any of the girls complained. Sometimes she took payment in shoes, like the almost new tree torrents she had on now, without socks because no one did. Becky flipped the mirror back with a snap. They needed cash too bad to daydream about makeup. Getting squeezed at all ends. One of her father's sayings that didn't make sense, but sure as hell got across how bad it was that spring. After another minute, she jumped down from the truck and went inside. Even though it was one of the first nice days in March, the front rooms of their farmhouse were dark and stuffy, closed in. Becky pushed up a window and propped it open with a can of beans. This morning's cereal bowls were tumbled milky white in the sink, and a thin, sticky layer of grease and dust filmed everything, but Becky had no time to wipe it up. In the family room, one patch of carpet stood out darker and new. Last week, her father had pawned the TV set, all her mother's jewelry, he thought all, Becky had hidden a few bits, and the blender. He wouldn't tell her how much he'd gotten, it's only temporary, but the crumpled receipt she'd found proved it was less than $100. "Daddy," she called from the bottom of the stairs, then ran up lightly, bracelets jingling. Have you not even showered?" For there he was, her bear-like father, curled on his side in bed, his silver hair mashed down low over his forehead, perspiration speckling his nose. Stomach flu, but there was no time for it. A buyer was driving in from Rockford, and her father was supposed to meet him at noon. "You said just turn on the engine. Daddy, it's already..." He groaned and threw a hand over his eyes. "Show him the drills, the light track air seeder. Make sure he sees that one. And the spreaders, even if he says he don't..." "I can't." Becky looked wildly around the room. "How am I supposed to..." "Tell him not the Massies or any John Deere. You can walk him back by the 2 Vicons. He'll want those. But say no. Just drills, that's our deal. Give me an hour, at most. I just need to..." "Oh God." He bolted from bed to bathroom, old terry cloth robe flying, and Becky fled before she could hear anything. So I'm going to stop there.
Thanks for that. So tell us what drives this. She's born or she grows up with a single father. What drives her into this kind of duplicitous? I mean, she really lives a double life in this book. How does she get there?
I think one of the reasons, and it sort of stems from this moment and a few moments that occur afterwards, is that she's growing up in a man's world, and she is being raised without a mother who died early. And she is helping her father with a failing business. So she's helping him to get back on his feet. And his business is a farming tools concern. So when she helps him save the business and turn it around, that also is almost an entirely male-dominated industry, at which she sort of steps in as a teenager and helps him through this. Then again, when she takes this job at the town government, she's the first female hire in the accounting department. So I think that one of the ways that she becomes who she is because she has to fight so hard against the diminished expectations for her as a young woman, against the sexism, against the sort of denigrating of her ambition. And I think it creates this kind of anger and fire in her, combined with her sort of special skill set to set up almost like the perfect person to pull off a long con. She's already been fighting against the world for so long that I think maybe she doesn't understand when she crosses over to committing crimes, because she's already been set up that way. And I feel like that has a little bit to do with Strang. I mean, we're not talking about both of our characters, yours from real life and mine fictional. We're not talking about people who come from wealth, that come from power or access or well-connected families. What about Strang, and where did he come from? And maybe, of course, I want to hear a little bit from you, reading from The King of Confidence.
Well, I want to read from your book just really quickly first, because I think it's interesting. Like there's this, the epigraph you used at the beginning of the book is a Edith Wharton quote.
Yeah.
Even now, however, she was not always happy. She had everything she wanted, but she still felt at times that there were other things she might want if she knew about them. I love that opening to this book, that sense that there's something else out there. It reminds me of the great line from, oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, from Tom Petty's American Girl, that I've always loved, which I've always thought was great critique of American consumer capitalism is this, right. She couldn't help feeling that there was something just a little bit more out there. And that seems to drive her, no?
Absolutely. I mean, I think, Becky lives a life that is not content unless she is pursuing this private passion and obsession for hers. At one point she ruminates that, do other people just live one life and are they content with that? She can't understand it. And to some degree, I think as a writer, I empathize with that. Do you know what I'm saying, Miles? Like,
I do.
We walk around not criminals, presumably, but with these whole other worlds in our heads. I mean, I lived with this story for 7 years since I started it to publishing it last week. And you talked about knowing, about Strang for a long time. And to me, that's one of the things I really sort of connected with Becky about, that having a double life for me means holding this other story in my mind, living it, creating it, writing about it, even before one other person knows anything about the book.
Yeah, no, that's wonderful. But I think both of our central characters are also just these people. I mean, it's interesting. They're both these small town kids, right?
Yes.
So Strang grows up in Western New York in what's called the burned over district, because all the great fevers politically, religiously, socially in mid-century America are happening there. And, he's just like this obscure person, but he has these, like Becky, he has this great dreams of getting out and becoming someone. He really wants to become king. And he, in his journals, he's leading already a double life when he's a young man. He's an atheist.
Right? Very young.
Yeah, I mean, his family is super religious, and everyone around him is. This is, one of the most intensely heated religious times in our country's history. And this is kind of the center of it.
Yeah.
And Strang is secretly an atheist, but he also, because he had this religious background, he writes that, when I talk about religion, people really get excited, and I really know how to do it, and I really know how to play them, basically. I'm paraphrasing him, of course, but he sees that he has this power. And I thought I might just offer a quick reading about that power, because I think it had to do very much with his time. So
Yes, please do.
great. Although James Jesse Strang was physically unimposing, a few inches over 5 feet and bald with an oddly bulging forehead, he did possess one distinguishing feature, his dark brown eyes, which one acquaintance described as rather small but very bright and piercing, giving an extremely animated expression to his whole countenance. Another claimed that those eyes seemed as though they could bore right through a person. But more than any tangible attribute, Strang possessed an invisible, ineffable aura called confidence. And in those days before electrical power, confidence was what made antebellum America hum. Confidence was black magic, good fortune, and hard cash combined. Confidence could turn worthless paper into glittering gold, cow towns into cities, empty lots into bustling businesses, losers into winners, paupers into millionaires. Confidence was a charm deployed by bankers and merchants, philosophers and politicians, clergymen and card sharps alike. Confidence was the soul of trade, in the words of one of the leading financial publications of the time. Without it, added Herman Melville, commerce between man and man, as between country and country, would, like a watch, run down and stop. In an age before the federal government began printing paper money, an age when people had to trust in privately issued banknotes, glorified IOUs, confidence was the de facto national currency. And Strang had this wonderful ability of instilling confidence in other people. And, we can talk about why that is, but I'm wondering how Becky managed to succeed. And obviously you based her loosely on this real life person. When I read about that case, because I heard it too, I'd written in The Island of Lost Maps it's another nonfiction book about a swindler who had strong confidence man traits.
Yes.
But the case you wrote about really fascinated me. And I don't remember thinking, how could a woman do that? I just thought, that town is not that big,
Yep.
and that's a lot of money.
Yeah. Well, it goes to what you were talking about with this word confidence, and that has all these different layers. And so you start by talking about, both our characters, right? They have this outsized confidence in their own abilities. This is an outrageous thing for a young man to want, coming from where he's coming from, right? To marry who would be Queen Victoria, and then later on to set himself up as this kind of, God ordained monarch of an entirely new religion. And Becky has that too, this deep belief in herself. But con artists are also, what they need to do is to create confidence in others, so that other people will trust them, will believe in them, will follow them, right? So it's this, you can't just have this outsized belief in yourself. You have to be able to persuade people. And I think that for Becky, one of the things that carries her through so much is that she is beloved in her town. And she was sort of the savior of her dad's business. And in this tiny town, as you mentioned, and I grew up in a small town myself, when everyone knows and loves you, and she, has this sort of tragedy early on of her mother, and, then kind of needing to be on her own after her father passes away, she's sort of welcomed in with open arms. And also, as someone with a lot of skills, she doesn't leave. She stays there. She works at the town government. And she becomes this sort of trusted single woman that everyone's like, oh, that's our Becky. She's always there for us. So the trust in her is kind of built from this bedrock trust that I think a lot of us have in our communities where we see people for a long time, you know? How do you like think about Strang? Like, how did he get people to believe in him? I mean, if as you say, this was a time of like tons of people setting themselves up. I mean, it was an active, thing for people to, sort of like have these religious beliefs and try to gain followers. And there were several of these. What makes Strang different? How did he
Right.
get
Well, this is
them?
yeah. So this is the period we get the term confidence man from. We know exactly when that term starts in 1849 in a New York newspaper, and it spreads like wildfire through, the mid 19th century antebellum America. And the reason is because there are so many people out there who are swindling other people. This is also the period of P.T. Barnum.
Yes.
And the place is wild with prophets and doctors selling fraudulent medicines. And there's a reason for that, I think. And I wanted to ask you about this. I think there are certain times that lend themselves to this sort of figure. So Strang came out of a period where there's just an incredible sort of upending of tradition and societal norms. And so there's a communications revolution, there's a transportation revolution, there's one of the greatest economic fiascos of all time that just breaks a bunch of Americans. And things are changing really fast. There are these demographic changes, the railroads are coming in, Americans are moving around. And so it's suddenly a society of strangers. And the truth becomes very malleable at times like this. And so I think people like Strang, who could really create their own truths, and convince people of those truths. I think there's sometimes, in periods that they are less open to those people. But I think this period of time was a time that was really open to these kind of people. It's also open to a lot of exciting new ideas, the abolition movement, feminism. It was real, but it goes side by side with spiritualism and all this crazy stuff.
Right, the crazy stuff. And he seized on, so he was perceptive enough. When you mentioned the communications, I was fascinated by the part you talk about with the newspapers as this kind of like pre-internet. Can you describe that? What was that about? Like,
so there's this thing. So it really was this web of news, and it really worked a little bit like, honestly, like Twitter works in certain ways. So there was this thing called exchange papers, and so because of federal law, you could newspapers could trade newspapers with other newspapers for free, and they did this en masse. So Strang was smart enough to figure out he could be on Beaver Island in the middle of Lake Michigan. It's on the edge of the American frontier. And because he'd been trained as a newspaper man, the first thing he did when he became prophet is he set up his own newspaper. He realized what editors would do is they would cut stories out of other newspapers and run them in their paper. And sometimes they would attribute the newspaper, but a lot of times they just run the story. And Strang just realized he could get stories about his utopian colony in the middle of Lake Michigan in papers all over the country. And he was really successful at it. He became a very famous man in his own time. So I think that was part of his success.
Yeah. That's incredible.
Yeah. I mean, and how about Becky? It's interesting because technology turned against her, right? There's these great pages where she realizes things are going digital and that email is just dangerous to her.
Yeah.
Right?
So she starts by sort of like a very analog version of her fraud. She creates fake invoices for services that were not rendered and submits them and has them paid into an account that she set up, and then she transfers that money into her own personal account. So for a long time, this works great. She has several different banks, and she's kind of trying to make the invoices themselves look very legitimate. Like she throws dishwater on the paper, and she has 3 different typewriters that she, we're really talking about the 80s here. But then of course, in the mid 90s, one of her art world contacts is doing a deal with her, and she says, well, call me next week. And he says, oh, are you set up for the email yet? Because we're going to do all our billing now through the email. And she's like, the email, why would we do that? And she suddenly realizes that the game is changing yet again, and she is going to need to adapt her activity, as she calls it. She has a private name for her, what she thinks of as her activity, because she could never call it theft, because she thinks that's too unsubtle a word. She is taking money, but she's also making a profit off of her art sales. And then she is pumping money back into the town. So she rationalizes to herself that, everything's fine. Of course, the gap is getting bigger and bigger, and she can't, the center cannot hold. But when email happens, it almost throws her for a loop. But Becky, being Becky, she surmounts that obstacle and is able to kind of continue raking in the money. So yeah, I mean, the instability of the technology changes, the way that you discuss the fact that, there was so much happening at this time, it does seem like it's ripe for people like Strang. But Strang became known by the president, right? Like Strang became known by the federal government at the highest level. We're not talking about like a local yokel swindler here. He rose to the top.
No, that's right. One of the things Strang did is he set up a pirate colony in Beaver Island, and he would raid towns, including Chicago. He'd send people down to raid towns. They'd come in at night and
by boat.
Yeah, on a boat or two, and then they would take out their guns and rob some stuff and head back to sea. And he sent horse thieves out all over the country. And one of the things my book does is document. There's been some controversy about whether Strang was really involved in such a wide-scale criminal enterprise. Well, the answer is he was. And one of the things my book does is sort of offer more solid evidence of his criminal activity, but so President Millard Fillmore sent in and I'm not making this up, Emily, he sent in the US Navy's first iron-hulled warship to raid the island and bring Strang back to justice. And so Strang and many of his followers, they were brought back to Detroit, and but Strang won the case. He's a trained lawyer, and he won. And when Millard Fillmore left office in 1853, kind of in disrepute, Strang was still the king. So this quasi-independent kingdom that he set up on American soil really had a nice long run. He, like Becky, he got his comeuppance. But I wanted to ask you, to what degree did Becky con herself? I mean,
yeah. This is a good question, because I think the challenge for me was, or what I was most interested in, is the psychology and the inner world of somebody who pulls off a crime like that. And, I wanted to know not just how does she do it, but how does she feel about it while she's doing it, right? So one of the things I think that I did was I set up her private language in herself, how she calls her, she uses this word, the activity, almost as a distancing way of kind of setting herself apart from the notion of a crime. At one point, she reflects that, she wishes sometimes that she could talk to someone else who had an activity, maybe just for an hour, because she feels so alone in what she's doing. And in a way, she's also very upset at her own town, right? This is her sort of conflicted love for the town that she's also stealing from. She's pissed that nobody there is picking up on the fact that she is bilking them to such a degree, right? So it's this very strange and I thought fascinating kind of, mashup of feelings she has for the place where she is and what she's doing to them. I also reference, I don't know if you picked up on this, but I reference an actual New Yorker article that I was fascinated by when it came out. It's called The Itch, and I forget the author, but it follows a group of people who have an actual itch on their body that can never be scratched. It's a neurological disorder, I believe, and there are people, their suffering is so profound. There's a story of a woman who scratches at night all the way through her brain pan to her brain matter. And it's horrifying. And as soon as I read it, or maybe I thought of it later, that's Becky for me in a way, because she talks about how even when she is able to buy the painting that she has dreamed of and worked on and tried to get and tried to fund for years, she's satisfied with that for maybe an hour, right? She's at rest, she's content for maybe an hour, and then she feels the itch start up again. So not to say people should have a ton of sympathy for her, but it's this kind of obsession is an affliction for my character, and it's a burden. I think in a lot of times she would have preferred not to have to live like this as she sees it.
Both of our characters, I want to ask you about Becky. I say that Strang is this mixture his whole life of idealism and opportunism, right? And they're at war with each other, I think. I mean, he truly was, well, on that, did he con himself? I think he did con himself in the way that I think our president cons himself, in that he knew he was committing all these crimes, but he also thought he was, a kind of a superior being, and that he was somehow, maybe he thought he was an actual prophet. But he really also, I think, did have utopian dreams. He talked about that. And, when I was reading your book, I thought Becky has her version of Beaver Island, which is the secret underground art room in her barn. I mean, it's this sort of place that exists in her mind as much as in the real world. Do you want to talk about that?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I agree. I love that comparison between Beaver Island and what Becky creates, which is her own private museum. I read an article one time about, like the 1% of the 1%. And sometimes when they do collect art, as they often do, they will set it up in this kind of industry standard, beautiful building that's got all of the accoutrements of a museum, and yet it's for one person or one family. So it's this private museum, which goes against kind of everything I believe in terms of how art should be accessible to people. But I had Becky use the barn that she knew and lived and grew up with, her father's barn, that she ran his business out of. And when she becomes so successful, she turns it into her own private secret museum, and she buries her treasures underground. She creates a lower level where only she can view them, these sort of ill-gotten great works of art. And it is kind of like her own brain down there. She's not someone who wants to be really with other people. She wants to be with these works, and that's where she gets her meaning. So in a sense, she kind of just sinks them down underground like buried treasure, and so she can spend time with them.
Yeah. Emily, do you think Americans are particularly, obviously there's con artists all over the world, do you think Americans are particularly prone to con artists?
I mean, I know we're fascinated with them, right? Stories of con artists have been in our fiction and our nonfiction. We know them from the era you're talking about, the 19th century, and we know them from today. We know Bernie Madoff and Elizabeth Holmes, and we're fascinated by these stories. So I don't think that Americans are more gullible. I wouldn't presume to guess, but I do think that something about the stories of con artists says something to us, something about leading a double life or getting people to believe in you as you create a new identity, a new persona, that seems like a very powerful trope, always.
Yeah, I wonder if there's something too in our own sense of self-invention that draws us to these people. Charles Dickens came here in 1841, and he saw a swindler at work in Cairo, Illinois, and he said to the local people, he said, because they sort of celebrated this guy,
right?
And he said, "Didn't he rip you off?" And they're like, "Yeah." And hasn't he ripped a lot of other people off? "Oh yeah, yeah." And hasn't he ruined a lot of lives? "Oh yeah, he's terrible. But you still like him." And they said, "Well, he's a smart man," this phrase, and he did smart dealings. I think it's that sort of interest in the big lie. You know, sometimes I think of the situation we're in now, where somehow there's something we like about someone who lies big in this country, and who steals money from a small town that it doesn't even come close to having. I mean, there's something wild about that, and I think that is maybe something American.
I agree. I mean, when you describe in your book that era of instability and constant change and sort of these sliding tectonic plates of social movements, that rang very true and resonant for me thinking about today. And, you know, I think there's a lot in these conditions that you describe that have to do with maybe the ability of someone to take over a mass, sort of group of people believing a lot of deluded and delusional ideas. But there is, a very similar situation that I think we have here that you describe so well as occurring, in the America of the mid 1800s.
Yeah, I as you know, I don't mention the 21st century, our current situation. I don't mention the present anywhere in the book. There's just two totally oblique. Well, they're not. One of them's not totally oblique, but there's no. I didn't want to date the book, and I didn't want to make facile comparisons between these two times. But from the first time I started sending it out to other readers and people and critics of that, they see it as kind of an allegory for our own times, and that doesn't upset me, because I think the two times were really similar. And I got to say, I wrote the book as President Trump announced, ran, and became president, and it really influenced. I think I would have written a different book if it had been in a different time. And so Strang informed Trump for me, and Trump informed Strang. Jennifer, we have lots of questions we could ask each other, but do you have any questions you want?
Oh, look, there's Jennifer.
We do. Hello. Yes, we have a couple of questions that have come in from the audience. And if you have a question, please feel free to leave it into the chat, audience members that are watching. The first one is, after writing about these characters, what insights did you get from why people fall for con artists?
Miles, why don't you take that one? That sounds like right up your alley.
Well, I think Strang offered people something they desperately wanted. And I think a lot of it was, I don't mean to oversimplify, but simple answers to complex questions. This was a time where there was just hugely confusing. But I think there was also, I gotta say, like, he gave them a sense of mission, and he gave them a sense of sort of beautiful victimhood. It was kind of, but they literally thought that they were going to bring in the second coming on Beaver Island. And now we may think that's nuts, but I don't know. I had an interesting, I was telling Emily about this yesterday. I had an interesting Facebook exchange with an old friend of mine who I have he's a very intelligent man. It was a guy I went to high school with, and I haven't been in touch with him for years. But on Facebook, I suddenly realized that he was a QAnon follower, or influenced by them. He was talking their game plan, as far as, the liberal pedophilia ring that some people running for president must have been part of. And I just thought, how, this man's so intelligent, how could this be? And I think that was probably how Strang's followers, relatives felt about them. And as I want to be fair to the guy I was with on Facebook, he probably thought the same thing about me. How could someone as bright as Miles, think that there are actually 215,000 deaths from COVID in this country, So I don't know, Emily, do you want to tackle that one?
You really set me up there, Miles. I'll just say that I think that one of the things that in my novel that I didn't do well enough in the first draft, maybe, is what this questioner is asking about. I didn't really bring home the pain that happens when a con artist deceives people who are close to them. And that was something that my editor asked me to really layer in the second draft of writing. And I think that I agree. I had gone I had had so much fun writing this novel, and so much fun with Becky and her crazy epic story, her career, that I had neglected sort of the painful sort of fallout that comes when you're close to somebody who deceives you. And whether that's a con artist or not, you know, we've all been there, and that pain is very specific and horrible, that pain of betrayal. So, you know, to me, it seems like there's a lot of human stuff that happens when we believe in someone and then are disappointed or deceived by them. You know, it can be just kind of a very sort of human and common experience.
You know, it's interesting, Emily, my editor was on me for the same thing, and,
Yeah.
and you enacted that, you know, beautifully through that best friend character.
Yeah, thank you.
And I thought that was, and he pressed me, Strang had married, well, he had 5 wives when he was murdered by his followers, 4 of them dead. And he really said, you need to focus on, you know, the small scale impact in this family of his actions. And so I was really grateful to him for that. And it's interesting that and I think I was just the same way. I was just so like, wow, Strang, this is so nuts that that he's like, no, look at the small tragedies.
That's really interesting. We have another question from someone who asks, we hear so much today about the big problems with misinformation and disinformation, especially in politics, but also in other types of business scams and other things. What parallels do you see today with the characters that you wrote about in your books?
Yeah.
Who are the con men and con women of today, I guess?
Well, you know, a lot of people bring up 2 women in the news a lot recently. One is, I mentioned the woman who was, I always forget the name of her, the blood typing business. Is that Theranos? The woman, Elizabeth Holmes, who intentionally deceived her board and everyone who invested in this company, knowing that the, you know, the product didn't work. And a lot of people, you know, lost a lot of money and careers, and, you know, there was a huge fallout. And then there's another story of a real life sort of pretend heiress named Anna Delvey. There was a wonderful memoir written by someone who had been conned by her. And she did this sort of social climber version, pretending to be from European money. That's often a very familiar trope for con artists, especially in America. You know, I think we always want to, you know, kind of like we ooh and ah if someone's connected to like royalty and maybe a tiny country that we, you know, don't know that much about. And so those 2 characters who are real life, you know, maybe have some connection to my fictional character, Becky. But, you know, in terms of the business scam, there's actually an incredible, of the real person who created this crime, there's an incredible documentary by one of Miles' colleagues at DePaul, and it's called The Queen of Horses. And I'm sorry, but I'm forgetting the filmmaker's name. I don't know if you have it on your mind, Miles, but I kind of encourage anyone who's interested in the real life version of the novel that I wrote to look up this documentary. It's really beautifully done, and I loved it.
You know, I'd add to that, you know, what I've noticed is about people who con a lot of people is that they're often a step ahead of the rest of us with technology.
Yeah.
So Strang he really understood newspapers in a way that I don't think a lot of his contemporaries did. A guy named Pope Brock wrote a wonderful book called Charlatan about this guy, Dr. Brinkley, who was the goat gland doctor in the 20s and 30s, who made millions off, it was like, I mean, he sewed gonads into men who were worried about their virility. It was like the little blue pill of the time. And it's nuts, except this guy was a total pioneer of radio. He's one of the inventors of country radio. He had these huge radio stations. And so, and I think to a certain extent, well, we saw it with the Russians in the last election and this election, but also with Trump and Twitter, this circumventing of sort of mainstream communication channels and saying, no, don't listen to them. That there aren't really people dying of COVID. That's a myth. Everyone's fine. Everything's great. Don't listen to that. Here's an alternate narrative, right? Yeah. And so I think that a lot of the big public con men I've seen are really good with media.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, and that's definitely a problem that we are trying to address at the library, getting people the resources they need to evaluate what media is credible and which is not. How long did it take each of you to write your book, and did what you had planned to write about or the story change over time?
Miles, you want to?
Yeah, it took me about 5 years, which is fast for me. So yeah, that 5 years. And did the story change over time? I gotta say, like, it may just be where I'm at in my career, and it may just be that I'm going to turn 60 in a few weeks and realize that life is short. But this one book, I kind of had a sense of it from the start. There have been at least 3 other good books about Strang, but they saw him as a kind of a footnote to the broader Mormon story, or a Midwestern story. Like one of the books is called Assassination of a Michigan King. And I just saw it as this national American story. I just saw it as a fundamental American story from the start.
Yeah. For me, this book was originated when I first heard the news story. And so that was in 2013. And I think I thought about it and took notes on my fictional version for about a year or two, and then wrote the draft. And it did go through a couple major changes. I actually had another character in the novel who is a kind of a peripheral narrator. And so if you know, or you don't know what that is, a peripheral narrator is sort of a tangential figure in the story who tells the story to the readers. So like, for example, in The Great Gatsby, Nick is the peripheral narrator of that novel, although Gatsby is the big story. And so what I started with was a peripheral narrator, a sort of small town young woman who tells us the story of Becky. And I was convinced by my editor to cut that out. And, yeah, it gave me a heart attack at first when she said that, but I think I wasn't quite courageous enough in my first draft to tackle what, would turn out to be this kind of, for my career, like sort of big plotty novel, big dramatic novel. I think I was still sort of clinging to a little bit of distance. Like I wanted this kind of normal person kind of grounding us in the story. But once I experimented with it, I saw that my editor was right, and that the story is faster and stronger and more true to itself when it just focuses on Becky. So yeah, it did go through that big change in the writing and rewriting phase. And of course, it's like a truism, and I know Miles would argue this too, like, it's a truism that editors don't edit anymore, but that is not my experience at all. My editor, Kate, was incredible in helping me bring this novel to its like strongest version. So she worked on it probably just as much as I did.
Ditto for my editor, Ben George. He's an old, he's younger than me, but he's got, I said in my acknowledgements, he's old school Maxwell Perkins type. Okay, next paragraph, next paragraph, next paragraph. It was pretty amazing to work with him.
Yeah.
I think that's great for readers to hear, because so rarely do we hear about the relationship between editors and authors. So that's cool. Thanks for sharing that. We have just a couple of minutes, so I'll ask you both the last question, which is, what is your next book or your next project that you're working on?
Well, I guess I'll jump in and say that it's still so unformed, but the pandemic and quarantine has been so hard on us, and I mean, in general, us. My family, very fortunate. But I really wanted to be working on something very light and fun and maybe sexy and funny and just not my usual sort of, story, I guess. So I designed a project that I would enjoy working on with those qualities. And it's purely for my own enjoyment at this moment, although, I'm having a lot of fun with it. I don't know if it'll ever see the outside of my computer, but I'm writing something funny and sexy. I guess that's all I can say. Miles, over to you.
Yeah, everything I write is funny and sexy. So I know, Jennifer, I'm writing some short fiction, which is my little avocation, and that's so much fun. And I think I've got a bigger project, and I will just say that I will be doing a lot of work at your institution if I decide to do this project. That's what I'll.
Well, you're always welcome inside the Chicago Public Library.
Well, I love it there, and but I will be me and Harold Washington will be hanging out.
There are a lot of writers.
Before you close us out, Jennifer, can I just offer thanks to Chicago Public Library. Thank you to you. Thank you to Seminary Co-op bookstores for sponsoring this. It's been such a joy, and I know Miles is with me when I say that, you know, libraries and bookstores seem like more important than ever during this time, and I've been so very grateful as a reader and a writer. So thank you for having us.
Yeah, I'm gonna throw one more thing on there. I just want to thank Cheryl Johnston, who is just a wonderful friend and associate of mine, and I'm just so grateful to her and to the library and to the bookstore. And I just want to give people a little pep talk. Like I'll do it for Emily's book. If you're interested, we're in an age where there, you know, you used to go in a bookstore and you'd browse around, right? You'd take a look. Look, right now, go to Seminary's website and buy Emily's book. And while you're at it, you can buy my book. And Seminary is such an amazing, great bookstore in Chicago. It's one of the great bookstores in the United States.
Yeah.
And like most bookstores in this disastrous last 10 months or whatever it is, it's been in real trouble. And so I urge you to support independent bookstores, but also to buy both of our books.
What
That was a great pitch, a great pitch, yes. And you took the words right out of my mouth. I just wanted to thank Cheryl Johnson for helping to put this event together, as well as our good friends over at Seminary Co-op, who, as you say, do need everyone's support, as do all our independent bookstores in Chicago. Let's keep them alive. Thank you so much, Miles and Emily. This was so fun. It was a good way to kind of start off spooky season, right? Halloween. You think about con artists, and magicians, and illusionists. So thanks so much for starting us off the seasonal fun here with your books. And thanks to all of you for being here. This event will be available for viewing on demand. So if you have friends who wanted to come but couldn't make it tonight, just check the library website and you can watch it. Have a great night, everybody.